The obsidian spire of the High Synod pierced the purple gloom of the capital world's upper atmosphere, a jagged needle of black glass, standing as a testament to 10 millennia of undisputed galactic dominion. Inside the grand chamber, the air was thick with the scent of ozone, and the heavy, musky pheromones of anxiety exuded by the gathered representatives of the Krellin ascendancy. This was not a meeting of celebration, nor was it a gathering for the distribution of spoils, which had been the primary function of the Synod for as long as any living being could remember. This was a convening of silence, a hush so profound that the hum of the anti-gravity suspensors holding the massive circular table aloft sounded like the roar of a distant waterfall. High Archon Vrexel sat at the zenith of the table, his carapace polished to a shimmering iridescence that usually commanded absolute terror and respect. Yet today, his compound eyes twitched with a nervous energy he could barely suppress. The holographic star charts hovering in the center of the room, usually a comforting display of the Ascendancy's sprawling territory, were currently dominated by a single, pulsating red anomaly on the extreme periphery of the known sectors, a sector that had been designated a dead zone, a graveyard of silence, for 10,000 years. The silence was broken not by a voice, but by the shifting of chitin against heavy ceremonial robes as Subcommander Thrak, the Minister of War, leaned forward, his mandibles clicking softly in a rhythm that betrayed his deep-seated confusion. He gestured toward the red pulsation in the void, a gesture that encompassed both dismissal and a creeping, primal dread that he refused to articulate. The anomaly was not behaving according to any known laws of slipspace mechanics or warp field theory. It was not a singular entry point, nor was it a natural phenomenon like a collapsing star or a wandering black hole. It was a rupture. The fabric of spacetime in the dead sector was not merely bending. It was being meticulously unzipped by a force that did not register on their standard energy scales, a force that felt less like technology and more like a violation of the natural order. Vrexel watched the telemetry scrolling down the side of the projection, the data streams moving so fast they blurred into a waterfall of crimson warnings, and he remembered the ancient histories, the dusty data crystals that were kept in the deepest vaults of the spire, records that spoke of a species that had once dared to refuse the Ascendancy's gift of subservience. "The sensors are malfunctioning," Thrak stated, though his voice lacked the booming resonance of certainty that usually accompanied his pronouncements. "There is no civilization in that sector. We burned it. We burned it until the crust of their cradle world cracked and the atmosphere boiled away into the vacuum. The silence of the ape has held for 10,000 cycles. To suggest that this is a return is not only heresy against the history of the Ascendancy, it is a logistical impossibility." He looked around the table, seeking validation from the other counselors. The fluid, aquatic Hydrali ambassador in her suspensor tank, the silicon-based Lithos representative who sat like a statue of granite, and the avian skylords who preened their feathers with nervous, jerky motions. None of them met his gaze. The fear in the room was a tangible weight, a pressure that pressed against their chests and minds, born of the collective memory of a war that had almost broken them before the final victory was achieved. Vrexel tapped a claw against the obsidian surface of the table, the sharp sound echoing like a gunshot in the vast chamber. "Malfunctions do not coordinate their arrival vectors," the High Archon said, his voice a low rasp that vibrated through the floor. "Malfunctions do not bypass our listening posts without triggering a single alarm until they are already within the inner perimeter. Look at the energy readings, Thrak. That is not background radiation. That is a directed wake. Something immense is moving through the dark, and it is moving with a purpose that defies our understanding of propulsion. We are not dealing with ghosts. We are dealing with a failure of our own arrogance." He stood up, his towering form casting a long, distorted shadow across the holographic map, and pointed a trembling claw at the location where the anomaly was strongest, the coordinates of the Sol system, a place that was supposed to be nothing but ash and debris. "They are coming from the graveyard. And they are not coming alone." As if in response to his words, the grand chamber shuddered. It was not a physical impact, but a psychic tremor, a resonance that vibrated through the very molecular structure of the spire. The holographic display flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness save for the ambient bioluminescence of the attendees and the cold starlight filtering through the translucent walls. Then, a new light appeared. It did not come from the projectors, but from the center of the room itself, a coalescence of hard, white light that formed a perfect sphere. From within the sphere, a sound emerged, a tone, pure and mathematical, traversing the octaves in a sequence that the Ascendancy's linguistic algorithms immediately recognized as a prime number sequence, a universal declaration of intelligence. But beneath the math, there was something else, a low, thrumming undertone that sounded like the slow, rhythmic beating of a colossal heart, or perhaps the marching of a billion boots in unison. The sphere expanded, dissolving the darkness, and resolved into a tactical display of terrifying clarity. The dead sector was no longer dead. Where there had been empty void, there was now a fleet. But to call it a fleet was to insult the magnitude of what the counselors were witnessing. It was a megastructure of ships, a moving wall of metal and energy that spanned the width of a solar system. There were no individual engine flares, no chaotic thruster burns. The armada moved as a single, cohesive organism, a tide of matte black hulls that absorbed the light of the stars they passed. They did not reflect, they consumed. At the forefront of this obsidian wave was a vessel of such gargantuan proportions that it registered on the sensors not as a ship, but as a celestial body, a dreadnought the size of a small moon, shaped like a spearhead, its surface bristling with weapon emplacements that defied classification. And etched into the side of that Titan, visible even across the gulf of space through the high-resolution projection, was a symbol that made Vrexel's blood turn to ice. A stylized, geometric representation of a bird of prey, rising from flames. "The Phoenix," Vrexel whispered, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "The symbol of the Terran Republic, but they were destroyed. We saw the cities burn. We watched their fleets turn to vapor." The panic in the room erupted then, a cacophony of screeching, clicking, and bubbling languages as the representatives realized the impossibility of their situation. The Ascendancy had fleets, yes. They had armadas that patrolled 1,000 systems, imposing their will upon lesser races. But compared to the Leviathan approaching their borders, their ships looked like toys, fragile things of glass and ego. The Terran fleet was not built for conquest. It was built for extermination. It was a hammer forged in the dark, tempered by 10,000 years of cold, silent hate, or so it seemed. Thrak was shouting orders into his comms unit, demanding the immediate mobilization of the Home Guard, the activation of the planetary defense grid, the priming of the antimatter batteries. But even as he shouted, he knew it was futile. The speed at which the Terran fleet was moving suggested they had mastered a form of inertialess drive, allowing them to traverse the distance between the outer markers and the capital world in moments rather than days. "They are hailing us," the communications officer, a tremulous creature named Zin, announced from the lower pit of the chamber. It is a wide-spectrum broadcast. It is overriding every frequency. Civil, military, emergency. They are speaking to everyone." "Put it on screen," Vrexel commanded, sinking back into his chair, trying to summon the dignity of his station. "Let us hear what the ghosts have to say." The white sphere in the center of the room shifted again, resolving into the image of a human. But this was not the human of the historical archives, the soft, fleshy, desperate creatures that had pleaded for mercy as their oceans boiled. This figure was encased in armor that looked like it had been grown rather than manufactured, a sleek, interlocking carapace of dark gray metal that shimmered with internal energy fields. The helmet was removed, revealing a face that was severe, pale, and etched with lines of profound stoicism. The eyes were the most striking feature. They were cybernetic, glowing with a soft, blue luminance, scanning the viewer with an intensity that felt like a physical dissection. Behind the figure, the bridge of the dreadnought was visible, a cavernous space of hushed activity, where hundreds of humans worked in total silence, interfacing with holographic terminals that floated in the air. There was no chaos, no shouting, no fear, only a terrifying, absolute calm. "I'm High Admiral Valerius of the United Terran Reclamation Authority," the human spoke, his voice modulated to perfect clarity in the trade tongue of the Ascendancy. "I address the High Synod of the Krellum and the vassal states of the Ascendancy. 10,000 standard cycles ago, your predecessors declared a war of annihilation upon the solar system of Sol. You designated our species a plague, a chaotic variable that needed to be excised from the galactic equation. You executed the protocol of Ash. You believed you succeeded." Valerius paused, and the camera zoomed in slightly, capturing the utter lack of emotion on his face. It was not anger, it was not rage, it was the cold detachment of a judge reading a verdict. "You were mistaken. We did not die. We went into the dark. We retreated to the places where you could not follow, to the gravity wells of neutron stars, to the drifting nebulae of the galactic rim, to the spaces between the spiral arms where the radiation would strip the shielding from your ships. We survived. We adapted, we rebuilt, and we remembered. Cut the transmission, Thrak roared, slamming his fist onto the table. Do not let him spread fear among the populace. I cannot, Zin wailed. They have locked us out, they control the grid. Valerius continued, ignoring the interruption as if he were standing in the room with them. We have returned not for conquest, and not for the petty redistribution of resources that defines your empire. We have returned to close the circle. You built your ascendancy on the charred remains of our home. You used the resources stripped from our dead world to fuel your expansion. You erased our history and replaced it with a footnote about the necessity of order. Today, that order ends. We are not here to negotiate terms of surrender. We are here to implement the restoration. Stand down your weapons, deactivate your shields. Any vessel that powers its weapons systems will be dismantled. This is your only warning. Valerius out. The transmission cut, leaving the grand chamber in a silence that was heavier than before. The threat was specific, dismantled, not destroyed, not vaporized, dismantled. It implied a precision that was more terrifying than brute force. It implied that they could pick the ascendancy apart bolt by bolt, and there was nothing the Krellin could do to stop them. They are bluffing, the Lithos representative rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. They have been hiding in the dark for millennia. They cannot have the resources to challenge the combined might of the ascendancy. They rely on shock and fear. We must strike now while they are transitioning from slipspace. Look at the sensors, Vrexel hissed, pointing at the restored telemetry. They are not transitioning, they are here, they are in orbit. The sky outside the translucent walls of the spire darkened. It was not the darkness of night, nor the shadow of a cloud. It was the shadow of metal. The Terran fleet had arrived, and it had blotted out the sun. The capital city of Othra, a sprawling metropolis of gold and crystal towers that housed billions, was suddenly plunged into a twilight gloom. Looking up, the citizens of the Ascendancy saw the sky filled with the geometric shapes of the Terran ships, hanging silently in the upper atmosphere, defying gravity with an arrogance that shook the foundations of their belief in Krellim's superiority. They did not fire. They simply hovered, millions of tons of alloy and composite, casting a judgment of shadow over the world below. Act 2, Human Reveal. The panic that followed was predictable, a chaotic scrambling of fleets and the terrified screams of a populace that had never known war on their own soil. But the Terran response to the Ascendancy's frantic defense was the first true shock of the new era. The Krellim orbital defense platforms, massive stations armed with plasma lances capable of cracking continents, opened fire. Beams of superheated energy, brighter than small stars, lashed out at the dark hulls of the Terran ships. The counselors in the spire watched, holding their breath, expecting to see the human vessels disintegrate. Instead, the beams hit the black hulls and vanished. There was no explosion, no flare of shields buckling under stress. The energy was simply absorbed. The matte black material of the Terran ships drank the plasma, rippling slightly like a stone thrown into a pond, and then returned to stillness. The energy enough to power a city for a year had been nullified, fed into capacitors that must have been bottomless. Then came the countermove. It was not a return volley of fire. The Terran ships emitted a pulse, a concentrated burst of electromagnetic dissonance that washed over the defense platforms. Instantly, the lights on the Krellim stations died. Reactors shut down. Artificial gravity failed. The crews on board were not harmed. They were simply left floating in the dark, their weapons useless bricks of metal. The humans had not fired a single shot in anger. They had simply turned the Ascendancy's weapons off. Impossible, Thrak whispered, slumping into his chair. That is impossible. To dampen a plasma lance requires energy equal to the output. To disable the stations without destroying them requires a knowledge of our systems that they have had 10,000 years to acquire, Vrexel finished for him. They have been watching us, listening to our transmissions, studying our blueprints. They know our technology better than we do. A notification chimed on the console. A transport shuttle had launched from the lead Terran dreadnought, the Aegis of Saul. It was heading directly for the Obsidian Spire. It was not a dropship filled with soldiers. It was a diplomatic courier, sleek and unarmed. They are sending a delegation, Vrexel said, realizing the game had changed entirely. They do not fear us enough to send an army. They are sending a messenger. The arrival of the Terran delegation was a spectacle of calculated humility and overwhelming power. They did not land on the grand landing pad. The shuttle simply stopped in midair outside the grand chamber's balcony, and a bridge of hard light extended from its hatch to the spire. The airlock cycled, and 3 figures stepped out. They were not giants, nor were they monsters. They were human. Leading them was not the admiral from the broadcast, but a woman dressed in robes of deep crimson and charcoal, the colors of dried blood and ash. She carried no weapon, but in her hands she held a simple, ancient-looking urn made of ceramic. She was flanked by 2 guards in the power armor seen earlier, but their weapons were holstered. They walked with a fluid grace, their boots making no sound on the polished floor. Vrexel stood to meet them, surrounded by his terrified council. He tried to project the authority of an emperor, but he felt like a child caught in the gaze of a predator. "I am High Archon Vrexel," he announced. "You have violated our sovereign space. You have disabled our defenses. Explain yourself." The woman stopped 10 paces from the table. She looked at Vrexel, then at the other counselors, her gaze lingering on each species. Her eyes were dark, unaugmented, and filled with a sorrow so deep it felt like a physical weight in the room. "I am Ambassador Alara Vance," she said, her voice soft but carrying to every corner of the silent hall. "I am the keeper of the memory, and we have not violated your space, Archon. We have returned to the space that was stolen from us." She stepped forward and placed the ceramic urn on the obsidian table, right in the center, amidst the holographic controls. "Do you know what this is?" she asked. Vrexel stared at the urn. It looked primitive, crude. "It is a vessel," he said dismissively. "It is Earth," Alara said. She reached out and removed the lid. Inside was gray, coarse ash. "This is soil from the crater where the city of New York once stood. It contains the carbonized remains of silicon, steel, and bone. It contains the genetic memory of 3 billion people who burned when your predecessors initiated the Protocol of Ash. For 10,000 years, every human child born in the void has been given a pinch of this ash. Not to teach them hate, but to teach them what happens when vigilance fails. To teach them the cost of weakness." "You seek revenge," the Skylord representative chirped, ruffling his feathers. "You have come to burn us in return, an eye for an eye. It is the primitive way." Alara looked at the Skylord, and a faint, sad smile touched her lips. "If we wanted revenge, your sun would already be a nova. We have the technology to collapse stars, Counselor. We have stripped the accretion disks of black holes to build our fleets. We have lived in the dark where only the strongest logic survives. To burn your worlds would be a waste of energy. It would be inefficient. It would be illogical." This word struck the Council harder than any threat. Illogical. The humans were not berserkers. They were something far more dangerous. They were pragmatists. "We have come to replace you," Alara said calmly. "Your ascendancy is stagnant. You prey on the weak. You stifle innovation to maintain control. You have ruled this galaxy for 10 millennia, and in that time you have not advanced. You are still using the same plasma drives, the same warp fields, the same feudal politics that you used when you burned Earth. You are a dead empire walking. We are the future." "You cannot simply replace us," Thrax sputtered, though his bluster was fading. "We are trillions. We have fleets in 1,000 systems." "Your fleets are currently being disabled," Alara noted, glancing at a datapad on her wrist. "As we speak, Terran peacekeeper units are securing the orbital infrastructure of your 12 major hub worlds. We are not killing your soldiers. We are locking their armor suits. We are hacking their navigation computers. We are grounding them. We are taking the keys to the galaxy away from you because you have proven you are not responsible enough to hold them." She gestured to the guards, and one of them stepped forward, projecting a hologram into the air. It showed a scene from one of the outer colonies, a world the Ascendancy treated as a slave mining camp. Terran dropships were landing, but they were not disgorging troops. They were offloading medical synthesizers, atmospheric scrubbers, and food replicators. The slave populations were not running in fear. They were watching in awe as the humans began to dismantle the shock collars and the guard towers. "This is the vengeance of humanity," Alara said, her voice swelling with quiet pride. "We do not burn, we build. We do not enslave, we liberate. We are going to restructure your economy. We are going to dismantle your caste system. We are going to introduce a system of universal rights that applies to every sentient being, regardless of biology. And we are going to put the leaders who ordered the genocides and those who maintained the systems of oppression on trial. A public, fair, and legal trial." Vrexel felt his knees weaken. He had expected death. He had expected martyrdom. He had not expected to be made irrelevant. He had not expected to be sued for peace and dismantled by bureaucracy and superior ethics. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why spare us after what we did?" Alara placed her hand on the urn of ash. "Because we are not you. If we burned you, we would become the very thing we despise. We carried the fire of Earth in our hearts so that we would never let the light go out. But fire can warm as well as consume. We chose to be the warmth in the void, not the inferno. But then her expression shifted. The sorrow remained, but a layer of steel slid underneath it. She looked up at the ceiling, through the transparent roof to the stars beyond. And, because we need you. We need every ship, every soldier, every resource this galaxy has to offer. We did not spend 10,000 years building this fleet just to reclaim our home. We built it because we saw what is coming behind us. Act 3, Unity and Larger Twist. The shift in the room was palpable. The political tension evaporated, replaced by a colder, more primal fear. Vrexel looked at the human ambassador, really looked at her, and saw the exhaustion hidden beneath her calm facade. He saw the way the guards constantly scanned the perimeter, not for Krellim threats, but for something else. "What is coming?" Vrexel asked. Alara tapped her wrist console, and the projection in the center of the room changed. The image of the galaxy zoomed out, pulling back until the spiral arms were just a disk of light in the dark. Then it zoomed out further into the intergalactic void. There, in the deep black between galaxies, was a shadow. It wasn't a fleet. It wasn't a nebula. It was an absence of light, a creeping stain that was blotting out the background stars. "We call it the entropy tide," Alara explained. "While we were hiding in the void, we looked outward. We established listening posts in the dark space between galaxies. We heard the silence spreading. Entire galaxies are going dark, Archon, one by one. Something is consuming the energy of the universe. It is a swarm, a hive mind of biological machines that feed on thermodynamics. They eat heat. They eat light. They leave nothing but absolute zero in their wake." The counselors stared in horror. The petty squabbles over trade routes and border taxes seemed suddenly insane. "They are drawn to high-energy concentrations," Alara continued. "The Ascendancy, with its wasteful plasma networks and unshielded warp signatures, is a beacon in the dark. They are coming here. They will be here in less than 5 standard cycles. That is why we returned now. That is why we had to take control. You were shouting into the void, ringing the dinner bell for a predator you couldn't even see." Thrak stood up, his warrior instincts finally finding a target he could understand. "A swarm? Can it be fought?" "Alone? No," Alara said. "We tried to fight a scout tendril of the tide 3,000 years ago. We lost 6 colony fleets. That is when we realized we needed numbers. We needed the industrial capacity of the entire galaxy. We needed you. We don't need you to lead. You've proven you can't. But we need your factories, your raw materials, and yes, your soldiers under our command and with our technology." Vrexel looked at the urn of ash on the table. The charred remains of Earth. The humans had not come to avenge the past. They had come to save the future. They had swallowed their hate, nurtured their grief, and turned themselves into the guardians of the very species that had tried to exterminate them. It was a moral victory so absolute that it crushed Vrexel's spirit more effectively than any weapon. "The protocol of ash," Vrexel murmured. "We burned you to save ourselves from a rival, and now you return from the ash to save us from extinction." "Irony is a concept we have had much time to study," Alara said dryly. "But we are running out of time. The tide is accelerating. The High Admiral needs your answer. Will the Ascendancy surrender its sovereignty to the Terran Reclamation Authority and join the Galactic Defense Coalition, or will you stand alone and freeze in the dark?" The silence stretched for a long, agonizing minute. Vrexel looked at his council. He saw the resignation in their eyes, the realization that their era was over, but that their survival might just be beginning. He looked at the massive Terran dreadnought hanging in the sky, a shield against the coming night. Slowly, deliberately, Vrexel reached out and unclasped the ceremonial mantle of the High Archon from his shoulders. He folded the shimmering fabric and placed it on the table, next to the urn of Earth. "The Ascendancy is no more," Vrexel announced, his voice steady. "We submit to the authority of Terra. Command us." Alara nodded, a great tension leaving her shoulders. She tapped her comms. "Admiral, the Council has acquiesced. Initiate Phase 2, begin the technology transfer, and tell the fleets to stand down. We are no longer at war." Outside, the massive shadow of the Terran fleet seemed to soften. Lights began to flicker on not weapons, but docking clamps, hangar bays, and guidance beacons. Thousands of small shuttles began to descend, carrying engineers, doctors, and teachers. The sky was filled with the hum of engines, a symphony of integration. Later that evening, Vrexel stood on the balcony of the spire, watching the activity below. The city was glowing with a new light, the harsh yellow of the Krellim sodium lamps being replaced by the clean, white light of Terran fusion globes. Alara stood beside him, looking up at the stars. "It will be hard," Vrexel said, My people are proud, they will resent you. They will, Ilara agreed. And that is fine, we don't need them to love us, we need them to survive. In time, perhaps, trust will come, but for now, survival is enough. You really believe you can stop this? Entropy tide? Vrexel asked, looking at the darkness between the stars with a new fear. Ilara picked up the urn which she had brought with her. She held it tight. 10,000 years ago, we were a single planet squabbling over borders, unaware of the universe. You burned us, and in doing so, you forged us into something unbreakable. We have survived the death of our world. We have survived the cold of the void. We have turned our grief into a weapon and our loss into a shield. She looked at Vrexel, and for the first time he saw the fire in her eyes, not the fire of destruction, but the cold, enduring fire of the stars themselves. We are humanity, she said. We are the species that refuses to die, and we are going to break the tide even if we have to burn the rest of the universe to save it. The camera pulled back, rising above the balcony, above the spire, above the atmosphere. It soared past the massive hulls of the Terran fleet, past the orbital shipyards already churning out new designs that fused Krellum and Terran tech. It moved faster and faster, leaving the galaxy behind, flying out into the intergalactic void until the galaxy was just a spinning wheel of light. And there, in the distance, the darkness was moving, a wall of nothingness, vast and hungry. But between the darkness and the light, a new line was forming, a line of silver ships, tiny against the dark but burning with a defiant brightness. The humans had returned, and the long night would have to fight for every inch. The screen faded to black, leaving only the echo of the promise. We are the species that refuses to die. The end.